Learning Teaching Enhancement Seminar of the year. You would remember on 25 March, we had our first one with Dr. Margaret Blackie, our second one with Dr. Christa van der Walt, or Prof. Christa van der Walt, on the 13th of May, and today is the third one. I'm not usually the one to greet everybody. You will remember that this is a Learning Teaching Enhancement Seminar. It is usually facilitated by Antoinette van der Merwe and then hosted under the auspices of the DVC Learning and Teaching, Professor Diresh Ramjugannath. But we're switching things around a little bit because Prof. Ramjugannath is our guest speaker today. So I am going to do the hello initially, some of the music at the end, and then I'm going to hand over to Dr. Antoinette van der Merwe to do the formal introductions. Thank you everybody for being here. Baie dankie dat julle hierso is. We have no PSL happies, no snacks, no canapes, so the fact that you are here is absolutely brilliant. Obviously, this is just a little intimate affair. Ons acroniem is LOV, Leer en Onderrig Verryking, so it is a love seminar, but we also publish this to the Center for Teaching and Learning's website, so we can be assured that this will be watched time and time again, and we will hold everybody to account. So, with no further ado, thank you for looking at my face, but I'm handing over to Antoinette.
Great. Thanks for that, Andre. You put pressure now to put on my face as well. Now I've got my cup of coffee here this afternoon. So colleagues, it is a pity that we can't have the SOTAPIs and the PSLAPIs that we normally have during our learning and teaching enhancement seminars. But thanks for joining us. I see we've got a really good turn up already. I see 40 plus 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. So nearly 50 people this afternoon in the seminar. So thank you so much for everybody for coming. And then it gives me absolutely great pleasure to welcome and introduce our guest speaker for this afternoon to you. So Prof. Diresh Ramjugannath is the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Learning and Teaching at Stellenbosch University. He, of course, joined us at the beginning of the year. Previously, he served as the Deputy Vice Chancellor Research at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, prior to which he served as the Pro Vice Chancellor Innovation, Commercialization and Entrepreneurship, also at UKZN. He was appointed full Professor of Chemical Engineering at the tender age of 31 and has to date published and co-published more than 350 peer-reviewed journal papers and over 345 national and international conference papers. He has also successfully graduated over 90 masters and 40 PhD students and supervised and co-supervised over 22 postdoctoral fellows. So that's really, really an impressive CV. Prof. Ramjugannath, we look forward to your presentation this afternoon and what you have to share from ERTLA to ARTLA, from blended learning support to hybrid learning, from the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning to the Scholarship of Educational Leadership. Where are we heading to next and how will we get there? So I think also in terms of institutional mechanisms such as program review, renewal, and the SOTL conference, how can we enhance the quality of our students' learning experience? How do we ride the next technological waves? Of course, I think sometimes we all feel like drowning in increased workload or being drawn into a whirlpool of pandemic-fueled despair. So in the year where we've decided to also grapple with issues of assessment, with institutional audit looming, how do we critically evaluate ourselves and carefully reflect on where we would be going? How do we plan when a tidal wave of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity seems ready to break? So we really look forward to your insights today, Prof. Ramjugannath, and I will hand over to you now. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Dr. van der Merwe. I think we should keep this a lot less formal. Please, everyone, it's Diresh. And thanks very much for that, Antoinette. Colleagues, it gives me great privilege to have to, I won't say give you a lecture this afternoon on learning and teaching, because I by my very, will be the very first one to admit that I am not an expert on the academics of learning and teaching. I understand learning and teaching holistically, from an academic perspective and from an institutional leadership perspective. And so my talk, to a large extent today, is not going to have, I'm sad to say, all the terminology that you normally would get in a very academic lecture with regards to learning and teaching. But hopefully you won't hold that against me. I'm going to talk in a very broad perspective with regards to learning and teaching. And I know that Anthea, when she probably prepared that abstract that was shared with you, went into a lot of issues regarding learning and teaching at the moment. I'm going to touch on just some of them. I think it's very difficult in a lecture of this time span or a presentation of this time span to be able to go into any kind of depth on all of those issues that have been presented in the abstract. So please bear with me in that regard. Colleagues, I'm going to share my presentation. So just let me know if you can see my screen coming up.
I'll let you know, Diresh. I can see your screen. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Antoinette. So, colleagues, the topic, and please, I must apologize ahead of time if I deviate to what has been said in terms of forward together in learning and teaching at Stellenbosch University, where to next. I think I'm very much going to talk about the where to next and what we should be doing as an institution, touch a little bit upon what we are doing as an institution at the moment and what we're doing exceptionally well. But really about, I would say, what our purpose is as an institution at the moment, and in particular from a learning and teaching perspective. So I think, we are, as mankind, we are always in a state of change, in a state of evolution. And if you go back, to what we would describe as our predecessors, and if you look at the rate at which the changes happen and the rate of evolution, and there's a graphic over here which talks about, for example, the tools that man uses and how we've been able to evolve in terms of the tools that we use. And then you see the tools that we use, especially in the last 50 years, have evolved at an absolutely massive rate. So we live in a time of evolution, constant change. Some will call it transformation. It's a long-scale transformation that we see ourselves in. However, the one thing that is certain is that the rate of evolution is increasing. And so many of you would probably have heard of something called Moore's Law. Moore's Law was applied to computers, and it tells you that the computational power of computers has been increasing or doubling every year. And you start to see that as well now in a number of other sectors globally, not just in IT. However, not all change is good. I've got the graphic over here of the McDonald's evolution. And what you can see happening over there is massification, right? But the analogy that I'm trying to draw over here is what we're starting to see in higher education at the moment in the country. We see a massification of higher education. And as a result of the massification of higher education, if it's not done well, then there starts to become issues around the quality of the education that we are providing as the higher education institutions. It's about whether we actually are preparing our graduates for the workplace, and what does that mean for the workplace. A lot of our qualifications, some may say, are already outdated. And by the time our students graduate, the world of work will be totally different in the next 4 or 5 years to what it is today. So it talks about curriculum issues, it talks about the graduate attributes, the skill sets and so forth that we develop for our students and in terms of our graduates. So I think not all change is good, but about how do we adapt that change to ensure that we can still persist with quality, we can still persist with producing a graduate that is effective and hits the ground running and is useful for the employer and actually makes a more meaningful contribution and has a greater purpose, not just in terms of their own self-development and how they take along their families and their communities with their self-development through higher education, but also about how they can promote on a more national and regional level upliftment of society. So that's really about how we got to look at this whole change and shift in learning and teaching. As I mentioned a bit earlier, evolution or change or transformation is not unique to a particular sector. It cuts across everything from communication to architecture to communications and mobile devices to transportation. You've seen that there's been this rapid shift, and especially over the last 50 years. In fact, if you were to talk about communications in the last 10 years, there's been such a massive shift in evolving in communication. So the question is, are we in the higher education sector, and in particular in learning and teaching, evolving at the rate at which other sectors are evolving? I think that's a very important question we're going to ask ourselves, because I think a lot of times we remain fairly stagnant and we have very little change in our curricula. In fact, I would go as far as to say that in the majority of higher education institutions in the world at the moment, we are teaching or transferring information and knowledge that is totally outdated. It's outdated. It's been outdated for years, and our students and our graduates actually have no use for that information that we are sharing with them. So I think it's about how do we evolve it and get our students to the most up-to-date skill sets and knowledge so that they become more effective as citizens. Now, the whole way universities are seen and the way they've evolved has been over the last thousands of years. You know, universities are very old institutions, and the way they started off was academic training grounds for privileged intellectuals, nobility, and so forth. And then when the Industrial Revolution took place, then it kind of shifted, and it shifted over a period of time to kind of equipping people for the workplace. But interestingly enough, this is an excerpt from the inauguration speech by the rector of the University of St. Andrews in 1865, John Stuart Mill. And if you read that carefully, he basically says that this is well into the Industrial Revolution now, is that the purpose of universities is not to equip people to become better engineers or scientists or teachers or anything along those lines. It's really it's to teach knowledge, and that is it. So I think you could see that even at that point in time, they were well into the Industrial Revolution, but universities even then were not catching up in terms of what the need was. Then you move forward and you see the concept of modern university, which is about 100 to 120 years old, and it's the training of skilled individuals for the workforce. And we are still to a large extent very much in that kind of space where we are equipping our students for what we believe they would require for the workforce. But I think in a lot of cases we are, and I'm not saying it's at SU, but I think a lot of universities globally are totally misunderstanding what the requirements are of the workplace, not just at the moment, but of the workplace in the next 5 or 10 years. And so we as an institution have got to pay a lot of attention to that, so that we develop our curricula, we develop our programs, we develop the outcomes of our curricula and our programs, and we continually renew the programs. And we talk about program renewal, you know, I remember a few years ago, people were happy with saying, you know, we relook at our programs and we relook at our curriculum every 5 to 6 years. And if we're doing that, we're doing it extremely well. We know that in some sectors, for example, you know, developments are taking place every 12 to 18 months. There's massive shifts in development. So I've seen this. There's a university in India called the University of Chandigarh. They actually look at their programs and they look at their curriculums every 24 months. Every 24 months, they call a meeting of the entire advisory committee, which is industrial partners, municipalities, civil society, other stakeholders from other higher education institutions, and they meet and they discuss what they're going to undertake in terms of renewing their curriculum. So the curriculum is up to date. It's only a year or 2 years every year or 2 years, they actually continue renewing it. And they always got that mindset that we're preparing the graduates for what the workplace needs in the next 3 to 5 years. So just bearing that in mind, that we also seen a shift, in terms of the concept of research-led universities. And I think a lot of universities in South Africa at the moment are driving this agenda and driving it in a big way, saying, we want to be leading research institutions globally. It's a concept that you've seen over the last 20, 30 years. But looking at the way the world has shifted, universities are still training students to be good employees. And I'll talk in a few slides about the challenges we're currently facing in South Africa, but we got to have a total mindset shift over here. Yes, our duty is to impart knowledge and to develop critical thinking and so forth, but it's also about creating individuals that start to see their roles not just as employees, but also as employment creators, as enterprise creators. And so that brings us to the whole concept now that we see in a number of leading global institutions, which is that of being innovative, engaged, and entrepreneurial universities. So that's the shift in terms of what we had in higher education over the last 1,000 years, with a significant shift, obviously, over the last 20 to 30 years. And you see it leading institutions globally, this major shift towards what it means to be an innovative, engaged, and entrepreneurial university. And I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of how it affects us in learning and teaching. I think if you've been in the innovation space, you would see that with any innovation or any idea, you go from a point at which you have the invention of the idea, you develop it, it then becomes best practice. And at that point in time, if you don't have some sort of disruption that takes place, either in terms of incremental disruption or total disruption, then you find it becomes a habit. And then once it becomes a habit, it becomes old-fashioned, and then it actually dies away and dies off. We've seen this happen time and time again. It comes to companies, it comes to products, it comes to processes, and the same thing applies in learning and teaching as well. So we either going to then have a small incremental change, which puts us into a new trajectory, or we have a massive disruption that then puts us on a totally new life cycle, which then obviously would evolve into best practice. And the reason I presented it is because that's the way we must start to look at learning and teaching and how we evolve the curriculum and our programs within our institution. I'm a strong believer in partnerships and in collaborations. And in innovation, they have something called the innovation quadruple helix, where you have the key stakeholders that work very intimately together in order to get the change that you want. So in this case, there's basically 4 major groups of stakeholders. There's us in the research and education sector. There's civil society. There's public administration, which is basically government. And in South Africa, it's 3 tiers of government. It's the local municipalities, it's your provincial government, and your national government. And then there's business, which is basically industry in the private sector. And what you find is that when you start to work in this kind of quadruple helix manner, you get major innovation, you get major transdisciplinary research and learning and teaching that takes place. And the reason I mention this is because if we're going to be creating employable graduates, or producing highly employable graduates, or producing graduates that are innovative and entrepreneurial and start to create employment, it means that we've got to understand private sector and industry. It means we've got to understand civil society well. We've got to understand government, and we've got to work with them in understanding exactly how we produce the graduate that fits into the world of work in the future, and in terms of the kind of socioeconomic impact that we would want to have as an institution. So it's a total move away from this ivory tower mentality, which a lot of universities have had for a number of years, that we know best what should be in the curriculum, we know best what should be in programs, and government, business, you don't tell us what we should put into programs. It's really got to be one where we work with them, they advise us. A lot of leading organizations globally have advisory boards down at a departmental or a faculty level, which on a continual basis regularly informs the department and the faculty with regards to their curriculum and the updating of their curricula, so that the curricula is fit for purpose in terms of the needs of the various key stakeholders and potential employers, but also in terms of addressing the way the world of work is moving. So I think that's an important part, and I think that's the kind of way we got to see the way we start to evolve learning and teaching in terms of working very closely with these key stakeholders in evolving our curricula and our programs. Now, we know that we got massive problems in this country, and actually on the African continent, the numbers are not vastly different in terms of percentages. This number is a bit outdated. It says 7.5 million South Africans are unemployed. Actually, that number is much higher. It's probably closer to 10 or 12 million at the moment. But the important thing is that the worst affected are young people within the ages of 18 to 25. That's really the group, I mean, that normally we see as university students or as university graduates. And approximately 50% of them are unemployed. If you start to look at what the definition of youth is in this country, that's anyone under the age of 35. It's even worse. 73% of people that are unemployed are actually in that age group. So, one argument would be, no, evidence says that if you get a university qualification and your chances of being unemployed are far less, and probably it's true. However, we know that there are also an estimated 600,000 graduates with tertiary education that are currently unemployed. So a university qualification doesn't in any way mean that you have you guaranteed employment. And I think that's been one of the big challenges that we're having. Also, I think it's the quality of the training that's given to our students that also is critical in determining their employability. And I think that is where our role in terms of learning and teaching as well is extremely important. The holistic way we start to look at learning and teaching, and in terms of what we undertake as an institution. And we really need to see this shift. Is whatever we do as an organization needs to shift the way we start to look at our students and the training that we give them. It's not solely for the purposes of making them good employees, but actually giving them the skill sets and giving them the capabilities and the mindset to become creators of employment. So I think traditionally, when you look at the purpose of a university, we've got to ask ourselves in South Africa at the moment with these four major problems that we have in terms of unemployment, poverty, low economic growth rates, and massive inequality. Are we as the higher education sector playing our role in this regard, and especially with regards to what we're doing in learning and teaching? We know that a lot of universities are focused primarily in terms of whether we like it or not, I would say on a very kind of driven manner to produce as many graduates. So it's about the production of graduates in the learning and teaching space, typically in the undergraduate space, in the production of postgraduates and research outputs in the research space, and then community outreach. But what the country really needs is about universities thinking a lot more broader about us actually creating the mindset and the culture and embedding at a very early stage.
Suresh, I lost your sound.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you again, but we can't see your slides anymore.
Okay.
It's back.
Is that fine?
Slides are back.
Okay, great. So I think Stellenbosch University over a number of years has built up an absolutely fantastic reputation. And it's built up a reputation for the quality of our offerings. It's built up a reputation in terms of the support that we provide to our students, the support that we provide to our academic staff, and there's a number of initiatives that we've been undertaking in that regard. We have, and if I'm not mistaken, I would say by far one of the best success rates with regards to students in the country. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's probably in the high 80s or maybe even in the low 90s, depending on which years you look at, with regards to success rate and throughput of our students. So we're doing really well in that regard. But I think we need to start looking at the institution as one in which the values that we instill in our students and staff, and that entire experience that you have at the university must put our students in a position to function better in society, to identify with the institution, and to be able to then have that kind of socioeconomic impact that we would like to have as an institution. So the only way we're going to start to address the challenges that the country faces at the moment is by our staff, first of all, our academics understanding that the role of universities have shifted significantly. And if we want to be the institution that has that kind of socioeconomic impact, we got to then start to build it in terms of the pedagogy of our learning and teaching, so that we start to produce graduates that contribute to social cohesion and nation building and have that kind of social impact that we would want them to have. Students must have a truly transformative experience at the university, developing them into citizens that make meaningful and positive contributions to the world. I think that's got to come out in our curriculum. It's got to come out in not just the curriculum, but also in the co-curriculum and in our graduate attributes. And the learning and teaching portfolio speaks not just to the formal academic program and the curriculum, but as well to the associate informal curriculum and the entire student campus experience. So I think when we start to look at what is learning and teaching, it isn't just what takes place in the classroom and associated with the formal teaching, learning, and assessment. It's also about the entire campus experience that our students have, and that fits in very nicely with what we'll be looking at as an institution in terms of our strategy and our thematic areas in terms of our strategy. It's about effective, well-functioning, and innovative learning and teaching that takes place to contributing to our strategic themes. So when you look at learning and teaching, there's an entire value chain that we have as an institution. It goes back to us being able to attract the students, to have greater access to the students to the institution. It's then about the experience that those students will have on our campus. And then it's about if you want to call it the product that we produce as an organization, as a university, the quality of the graduates and their fit for purpose. It speaks to things like the graduate attributes about their employability, their fit for purpose, the impact that they have on society, about the pipeline of those undergraduate students coming into postgraduate studies, and about us maintaining that relationship with our students once they become graduates, a lifelong relationship that we should be developing with them. We've got all the building blocks within the institution, but it's about how do we ensure a nurturing and developmental ecosystem. So that is where also when I emphasize that when we start to look at learning and teaching, and within the Learning and Teaching Responsibility Center, there's two clear, should we say, divisions. There's the learning and teaching enhancement, and then there's student affairs. And we're going to also find ways in which we have a greater synergy and working between the two divisions, and especially with student affairs playing a more active role as well within the faculties. That's really going to push us in driving these kind of qualities and graduate attributes and fit for purposes that we will have for our students. And obviously we have all these enablers within the institution at the moment that ensures that we can produce this type of graduate that we would like to see. Now, we know, especially with COVID, over the last 18 months or so, that there's been a major shift in the workplace. And this is a slide, from Larson and Tobro, which basically talks about the way you start to look at the modern workplace. And having said that, even this has shifted quite a bit recently, the modern workplace. So, and then you compare that to what we have in terms of where we currently are, which is really the remnants of the industrial era. And so that'll be on your left-hand side. On your right-hand side is basically where we're going to in terms of the future of work and the modern workplace, and really about the digital age. And we talk about the digital age, then you start to talk about what do we need to produce in terms of digital talent for the digital age. You first start to look at the way people start to work in the future, or actually I won't say in the future, it's actually current, start to work in the digital age. You know, it's flexible hours. I think many of you can understand that, and you can link to that. It's about a productivity focus as opposed to a time focus. It's no more about, you know, are you in the office 8 to 4, 8 to 5? It's about whether you actually deliver in terms of your productivity. It's about you shaping your own career. It's about sharing is caring. I think especially in terms of the last 18 months, there's been a major emphasis on well-being and ensuring that you have a well-being for your employees and and for yourself. And focus on connecting. I think that's been the major shift in terms of the way we moved into online platforms and so forth, and on a premium on agility, on learning agility. So that's really, you know, what the digital age is bringing to us. We've got to ask ourselves, are our curriculums, are our programs at the moment addressing what is required of our graduates? I would say currently. And think about that going into the next 5 years, how that's going to shift, and are we actually doing that? So you can see the future. I mean, just breaking that down in terms of the various things and the way work is going to be in the future. And you can see on the left-hand side of here what I would say past, but I think some institutions are probably still stuck in this mode. COVID obviously has driven a lot of institutions out of it, but you know that kind of traditional way of looking at work has shifted drastically in the last 18 months. And as a result of that, we as an institution have got to say, how has our learning and teaching drastically shifted our thinking? Our thinking around learning and teaching has drastically shifted in that regard, in the way we structure and deliver in terms of our learning and teaching. Here again, in terms of the evolution of learning, I think you would see that in the past, you know, it is very much one-to-many, facilitator-centered, very much classroom learning, face-to-face, a lot of individual focus, and it's about the academic or the lecturer knows best, and they share the information and the knowledge with the class. We know that there's been major shifts in that regard due to the World Wide Web, about the availability and the accessibility of information and knowledge. And people don't necessarily have to rely on an academic or a lecturer to share that knowledge anymore. So the whole role in which we look at ourselves as lecturers and academics has shifted significantly. It's about being learner-centered. It's a lot of e-learning, a move away from individual focus to group focus, and we start to see a lot of that in terms of facilitation and in terms of expert facilitation. And then moving into the future, I think we're already starting to see a lot of these aspects already built into what COVID has done in terms of shifting learning and teaching over the last 18 months. It's now learner-driven. It's many-to-many, not one-to-many anymore. It's about the technology platforms that we're using and moving away from just e-learning to other technology platforms in terms of learning and teaching. It's now not more about group focus, but it's going to be about community focus and many-to-many in terms of engaging and learning and teaching, and about using the various technology and communication platforms in terms of expert sharing. Talking about evolution, changes, and transformation even further, and I'm just looking at the time, I think it is, I'm probably running out of time, so I'm not going to go into too much of detail. I think I touched on some aspects of this, but in terms of the jobs of the future, in terms of the fourth industrial revolution, the digital age, what's required in terms of greater entrepreneurship, experiential action learning, my feeling and I'm hoping that we all start to share this, is that our curriculum programs need to be continually updated and revised so that content, modes of learning, and the assessment and outcomes ensure that our graduates are fit for purpose. And I'm talking about fit for purpose, I'm talking about for the jobs that they will be going out into, or for the impact they'll be making, or for the purpose that they will be undertaking after they graduate. And it speaks about, do we start to still look at our traditional forms of looking at curriculum renewal on a much longer time span, or do we start to shorten the time span with regards to curriculum renewal? And how often do we start to update our content, and how do we start to look at assessments? Are we spending too much of time on assessments? Do we spend too much of time as academics on face-to-face? Because if you looked at the previous slide, where it's now about many to many, why are we still spending so much of time face-to-face with our students? In terms of the various other assessments that we undertake, the whole evolution of assessment, moving away from the traditional and reimagining assessment in terms of peer assessment, and in terms of self-assessment, where students themselves can start to understand and assess themselves, which then further enhances their learning ability. It's about aspects of multimodal learning and teaching, not just speaking to one traditional mode of writing on a board or visual transmission of information or audible transmission of information, about doing it in a truly multimodal manner. And about really developing multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary programs that start to speak to the jobs of the future. I think far too often we are caught up in this kind of silo mentality of disciplines, in the silo mentality of faculties, and we don't see the benefit of breaking those silos, of having truly multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary modules and programs that then caters for what we're starting to see in terms of the needs of the jobs of the future. And the pedagogies with regards to learning and teaching need to be continually evolving. And I'm glad to say that at Stellenbosch University that is being done, I would say, in a very good way. I think we're probably one of the leading institutions by having such a dedicated team in learning and teaching enhancement that drives this initiative of continually evolving the pedagogy of learning and teaching. But I still think a lot more can be done and a lot more should be done, especially when you look at the rate of evolution. The rate of evolution, if you have to follow Moore's law, it means we need to be doing things on a yearly to every 2-year basis, continually shifting and improving. So continuous professional development of our teaching staff in teaching pedagogy. Here again, we're doing really well in terms of the initiatives that we have. And I think the focus is should not be just on the modes of delivery, but also on the modes of assessment. And I know Antoinette and her team are working very hard in terms of saying, how do we reimagine assessment as a higher education institution? What is it that's going to make SU the differentiator amongst higher education institutions on the African continent in terms of our learning and teaching, especially with regards to our assessments? And I think we will find in the course of the next few months, you're going to see a lot of work being done in that area in terms of advancing the way we start to look at assessments at the institution, but also advancing the way we start to look at the way we manage our academic time and also our students' time in terms of the whole learning and teaching endeavor at the institution. Moving into the digital age, I think we've got to pay a lot of attention to virtual and augmented reality, and I would personally like to see a lot more of this coming into our learning and teaching. There is no need for us to say that everything needs to be laboratory based and it needs to be hands-on laboratory. The technology is moving to such an extent that you can use AI, you can use virtual reality in this kind of mode. And I was very glad to see the Faculty of Health Sciences starting to use that in some of their laboratories and their clinical training. So I think it's about how do we then start to fast track that across the institution. Assessments and accreditations, I talked about student self-assessment and peer assessment. We know that we're going through an institutional audit which is going to commence well, it's already commenced. Andre and the team will be briefing all of you over the course of the next few weeks on that. But I think it's really about the way we start to look at ourselves as an institution. We are a good institution. We have got a lot of very good structures in place. CHE recognizes that. CHE is promoting the move towards self-accreditation within the institution. How do we then strengthen our mechanisms within the institution to have a greater autonomy in terms of accreditation? And then I'm not going to go into a lot more detail, but I think you know that one of the big initiatives at SU at the moment is on hybrid learning. I think COVID has forced us into this kind of mode of ERTLA and ARTLA and so forth. But I think we are an institution that has a massive advantage over other institutions at the moment in the country. We've made a lot of investment over the last decade in terms of preparing ourselves for this rapid pivoting that we had in last year. But it's now about leapfrogging other institutions globally in terms of our hybrid learning and teaching. And you know, as we start to look at that, we start to bring a lot more the digital technologies in terms of artificial intelligence for monitoring for our student performance, progression, and total student and staff well-being. And you would see that we're developing something called Sun Success, which will start to bring that in. And I think we then start to see how students themselves can manage their success and their progress through our programs and through our modules. Colleagues, I must apologize. It is difficult to spend too much in-depth time on any particular item. I hoped I could just touch on a few things, but I think it's exciting times ahead of us at Stellenbosch University, and especially in the higher education space with regards to learning and teaching. And I'm hoping every one of you is going to play a role in terms of saying, how do we evolve this institution? How do we involve learning and teaching at the institution? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, Daresh. That really inspiring talk. I see lots of hands clapping coming up through the emoticons that people are using. So thank you very much for that inspiring look at the future, the transformation of learning and teaching at Stellenbosch University, and really encouraging us all to become part of that journey in whatever way and whatever shape we can become part of that journey. So colleagues, we have a little bit of time. We've got about 5 to 10 minutes for some burning questions, issues. So please put up your hand or post a question in the chat, whichever one you feel comfortable with. We really want to get your input and your questions to Daresh as well. Prof. Kuno, Gio, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramjigara. Thank you very much for that high-level overview. Very interesting. So I've got two very quick questions for you. Firstly, on a principled level, I perceive a little bit of a tension between two things that you highlighted as of particular importance to you, and that's on the one hand, the caring side, being a community, understanding our role in teaching and learning as not only caring within our community, but developing that caring capacity within our students on the one hand, but on the other hand, then advocating less face-to-face time, more technology, more distance, in other words, between the lecturer as the modeler of that caring capacity and the student. And I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts at a principled level around how do we mediate that tension. And then practically within your very area of responsibility, you say that we need to be more agile, we need to be quicker in dealing with our curriculum reform, and I absolutely applaud that. But my question to you is, practically, what can your responsibility center do to get us there? Because at the moment, it takes us 2 years to get anything through the committees just internally to make any major changes, and then we need to go externally if it's major. And I mean, that's just not a model that's going to get us to the kind of agility that you're talking about. So I'll be very interested to hear what practical thoughts you've got in making our systems just more agile in this respect. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that, Prof. Kuno. I think the first one, I think you're right. There is a bit of tension, but you know, I'm an engineer by training, and what we always talk about is the kind of optimal region in terms of the tension. And I think there is really an opportunity to find that optimal region. When I talked about the amount of time, I talked about the amount of face-to-face time. And if you look at the way learning and teaching is evolving, it's many-to-many in terms of instruction and delivery, and in terms of student learning as well. And it's about having, I would say, reducing the kind of one-to-many engagements and increasing the many-to-many engagements, including the peer assessment and the self-assessment. So it doesn't mean in any way taking away from the caring side. And I think greater amount of work needs to be done outside of the classroom, outside of the formal classroom, in terms of ensuring that our students, their mental health and their well-being is a lot better attended to. And that's a role that we play between student affairs and in terms of learning and teaching enhancement. So it's about getting that tension right. I agree with you. There is a tension, but I believe that there's an optimal, and I think we would need to look at that very carefully. The second one with regards to the agility, I think to a large extent, our limitations come in by organizations like CHE and SACWA and so forth, and that kind of engagement and lobbying in terms of engaging with those organizations is something that we're going to be undertaking as an institution. So just to give you an idea, is that we're trying to lobby and to be proactive in terms of the way we engage with CHE and with various other organizations and DED and so forth, with regards to the way we start to look at hybrid learning as an institution. And we can do that as well in terms of the other should we say, processes and accreditation processes that we follow as an organization. Let us not, think that this is something that other institutions have not grappled with and haven't found solutions for. I just mentioned one example of the University of Chandigarh, which does a renewal every 2 years. There are lessons to be learned. In fact, I just received an invitation from them, which I will pass along to the university community. And I think those of you that are interested, please, it's going to be an online platform whereby they'll be doing this renewal. And I think we can learn some lessons as an organization. But I think it talks also with being an entrepreneurial university, about ensuring that we put in place the mechanisms and we don't limit ourselves by should we say, bureaucracy that we've had as an organization in the past. So that will start to then build in the agility moving into the future. But yes, you're right that there are should we say, hurdles or stumbling blocks with regards to the time frame, with regards to being agile, which come in at a national level in terms of various bodies. But I think that is where we're hoping to as an institution, lobby and influence in that regard, so that we can have much faster turnaround times. Just in discussions with CHE and with the new CEO of CHE, I think we've tried to find systems in which we have greater integration. So one of the things you'll see now, there's an integrated template. So you don't have to submit multiple templates for accreditation purposes moving into the future. But I think these are all the kind of discussions that we will start to have. I'm not going to say this is something that we're going to be doing in the next year. It's going to take a bit of legwork in terms of us being able to have those discussions and to get us to a point where we can then start to become agile.
Diresh, just looking at 2 more questions maybe, because I'm looking at the time as well, and I would like us to end off at about 5:02. So I'll give you both questions, and you can see it in the chat as well. The first one is from Maya, saying that you've got a good vision, but how would you like to see these and your passion for change transferred to the staff? And then the second one of Dr. Herman Swart from the Department of Psychology talks about the link between school and university. So how are we going to prepare our incoming students to maximally benefit from evolving pedagogies of teaching and learning, given that schools are unlikely to be as agile as we are at the university? So it might be a disconnect for the students because they might be confronted with new technologies and approaches. So maybe just to take, I know they're not necessarily connected, but maybe just in terms of time, taking those 2 questions together.
So I very much see the way we were doing learning and teaching at this institution as a full value chain, and it's about, as I said, the students coming into SU and the students graduating from SU and then remaining as alumni for the rest of their lives. But I think there's a lot of work that we're doing as SU at the moment that we don't get credit for, or we don't get credit for. So telematics program, for example, does a lot of work in terms of preparing, or best you say, better preparing our students for their role, or for the admission into higher education. I think we can do a lot more in that regard. There's also a lot of work that can be done in terms of more adequately bridging our students before they start the academic the academic learning at a higher education institution. And just one example is what we did at the start of this year in terms of an onboarding program. I think there's great scope in terms of expanding the onboarding program. We also know that there's been initiatives in terms of partnerships we developed, for example, the Dell Young Leaders Program. It's about how do we expand on that and get a greater support base so that we have a better way of back integrating into secondary education and getting a better overall, should we say, upliftment of the level of learning at a secondary level, pulling that in through in terms of bridging any gaps that there may be from secondary to tertiary level, and then ensuring that through a holistic way of looking at our learning and teaching for our students, to be able to produce that graduate that has that kind of significant impact moving into the future. So I think that's what I'm hoping we'll be able to do, is to use some of the initiatives that we currently are doing to build on them through hybrid learning and through various other initiatives that we would plan to undertake, so that we build that full value proposition and pull all the way from secondary level into the tertiary level.
Thank you very much for that, Duresh. I think just two last comments coming in. That's more comments. Marion McKay saying she's delighted to hear about the block teaching model, but of course the SU timetable is challenging and monolithic. She's from the Faculty of Agri-Sciences. There's a comment from Anthea just saying, please colleagues, remember we value your feedback. Please take a minute or two to complete the feedback form. And then last but not least, from Alison Malitwa from APQ, I would think that our pedagogies are meant to meet our students where they are at, and perhaps not getting students to meet us where we are at. So hitting that sweet spot that we want to have with our students. So colleagues, with that, I would just like to take the time to say a huge word of thanks to Duresh for sharing his vision for learning and teaching with us this afternoon, for spending the time for the preparation, for engaging with us. And I think this is the start of many discussions and many conversations, of course, about learning and teaching that will continue over the next few years with Duresh, also within learning and teaching enhancement. And with that, I would also like to remind you that our last learning and teaching enhancement seminar this year is on the 21st of October. We've had a brilliant turnout this afternoon of about 60 plus people. So Duresh, that was excellent, that we actually had so many staff members, academics interested in coming to listen to you. So again, huge word of thanks to yourself for availing yourself, for sharing your vision, but then also to the colleagues for joining us this afternoon. I know how incredibly busy you all are. So thanks, Duresh.
No, thanks very much, Antoinette. And thanks very much, colleagues. I greatly appreciate you coming and listening. But as I said, this is not meant to be a lecture. This is really about sharing my thoughts. And as I said, there's a lot of work in development at the moment. And I think we would really appreciate your inputs in terms of how we take it forward.
Thank you very much, Duresh. And colleagues, have a great afternoon. And again, thanks for coming, and looking forward to seeing all of you again on the 21st of October for our last Learning and Teaching Enhancement Seminar. Thank you, colleagues. Bye-bye.
Salve Regina.
Danny boy, the pipes are